All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Engaging Students on Day One Using Collaborative Syllabus Design. I'm Brett Christie, and I'm VP for Learning Design and Inclusivity at O'Donnell Learn plus ISG. I've been in that role for a couple years. Prior to that, 25 years in higher ed, faculty level ranks, all that, and then faculty developer at the campus and system level in California. So pleased to be with you here today in this role. We've got a great session. This should be about an hour session. We're not looking to just fill that arbitrarily, but we've got a lot of great content for you and looking forward to your interaction and Q&A as we go along. Let's go next slide. And our speaker today is Dr. Meghan Owenz, who's an assistant professor of psychology at Kutztown University of Pennsylvania, which from what little I know is about an hour and a half northwest of Philadelphia. And maybe Allentown's kind of in the periphery there, something like that. Meghan has a doctorate in counseling psychology, 10 years of clinical experience, and 10 years of experience teaching in higher ed. Her research and teaching focus on inclusive education, methods for power sharing in the classroom, and just assessment. She's particularly interested in the intersection of student well-being, mental health, and andragogy. And I had the pleasure of attending Meghan's presentation in person this past summer at the Lilly Conference in Asheville. Great forum, great conference series. If you can attend that at some point, they have them around the country. But anyway, it's such an interesting topic. She shared her experience so well, and it was definitely something that folks were engaged around. It's one of those topics where people get it, they buy into it, they want to go for it, they dive in, or maybe they understand how it could be important, but they're a little bit leery about how to do it, what to sort of share control of, and where to start first, and how to kind of keep the bumpers on things. But then you also have people that are certainly skeptical of it. Why give students the choice? Why give them some power? And so there's that crowd as well. And certain skepticism is healthy, but anyway, we won't go there. So I continue to see this, besides going to this session, I continue to see this discussed quite a bit on different listservs out there and social media from different people in teaching and faculty development and instructional design. So I'm looking forward to the dialogue that we're going to have here today. Before I hand it over to Meghan, some quick logistics to make the most of the session. Please keep using the chat and make sure that you have it set to go to everyone, so that's not just going to the panelists. And then do it ongoing, make comments, ask questions. We've got planned breaks, and then I'll also be monitoring the chat while Meghan's presenting, so I'll help her out there. And there'll be times where we can address things in the moment, or it may be something that comes during a break. Also know that there's the option for the live transcription down at the bottom of the controls, bottom of your screen. If you want to turn that on, feel free. And so now it's my pleasure to hand it over to Dr. Meghan Owenz.
Thank you so much, Brett. I'm excited to talk about this in my classes. This has been one of the more successful innovations that I've done in the past couple of years in my classes. Just a little bit about myself is, Brett said I've been teaching for a while, and I will say when I first started teaching that I taught the way that I was taught. And so my students did not have a lot of choice in the classroom. I designed the assessments in the way that I thought were best. And then over the past 5 years, I've really become more interested in universal design for learning, in acknowledging the ways in which we design our classes and how that might differentially impact certain student groups and might create a classroom that is exclusionary, how I might have created assessments in the past that only allowed some of my students to succeed. And so I've been moving more towards really sharing the power in the classroom more in an effort to create a more inclusive classroom that allows all my students to succeed. So let me start. We're going to use Padlet. Please do use the chat throughout and ask questions. I'm happy to answer questions throughout as well as at the end of the presentation. We're also going to use Padlet just to get your ideas. So you can follow that link, and I'll head there in a second. And I'd like to know, what is your goal on the first day of class?
Yeah, so folks, as you go to the Padlet, just focus on the first column for now. We'll get to the others.
Yeah, to get students started strong, right? We have a lot of excitement and energy on that first day, and we hope they do too. Definitely to start making connections with our students, between our students. Um, Great, getting all the students to collaborate. That's one of my goals as well. To foster community, yep. And then to start to go over these expectations. What is this class? What are we going to do in this class? Establish good chemistry, the purpose of the class, and maybe try to start to link them in. How is this important to you or to your career, right? To answer some of those logistical questions that students want to know, right? So do I have to come here? And how often do I have to come here? And what are you going to do if I'm late? And those sorts of things, right? Going over the expectations for the class, create energy and connections, clarity, to get to know students, to allow them to start to get to know us, right? So these are big goals, right? For often one, maybe hour-long period if we teach face-to-face, or one, sort of asynchronous day when the students are logging into our class. So let me go back and thank you for responding to that. Let me share what my goals were as I, thought about this curriculum innovation and what I wanted to do. So I use a lot of active learning approaches, a lot of inquiry-based learning approaches in the classroom. So I wanted to set this expectation that they would come to the classroom and they would be active. They would be invited to be active and to be engaged in the class. And the traditional way that I had previously sort of gone over the syllabus, as exciting as I tried to be, didn't really set that expectation that they were active collaborators in the class, right? I wanted them to feel autonomous and empowered, right? That they had some choice in the class, that I was interested in what they were bringing to class. As many of you said, I wanted to also start to create this community and this sense of belonging among the students, and then set an expectation for fun too, among all that. So a ton of goals for that first day of class, and I've done a lot of different things in the first day of class, from like the traditional syllabus overview and expectations to having them do puzzles in small groups. But I'm going to talk to you today about creating a collaborative syllabus in that first day, that first week. So just a little bit of a theoretical background. This curriculum innovation is influenced by Universal Design for Learning. I did some training with CAST. This is where this image comes, is from CAST. And Universal Design for Learning is an application of the social model of disability to higher education, really. And so the medical model of disability says that, in higher education, maybe there's something wrong with a particular student, something wrong, quote unquote. And so we need to accommodate that particular student. And we have this really onerous process in higher education, right, for the student to achieve those accommodations and then present them to the faculty, and then get individual changes made to how they're expected to participate and demonstrate their knowledge in class. The social model of disability implies that it's not the student who's disabled, but the environment itself that's disabling, right? And so this was, this has been applied to teaching after being applied to the environment, right? So is a building designed in a way that's inaccessible, then the building is inaccessible. It's not so much the disability residing within the person, but rather within the environment. And I think this makes a lot of sense in higher education. And we also know that Universal Design for Learning is just good design. So research shows that it helps all students achieve in a classroom, not just your students with disabilities. I'm particularly interested as a psychologist in mental health and how things like test anxiety and performance anxiety might be impacting students in a classroom. And so Universal Design for Learning suggests that one way that we could create a better designed class is to provide multiple means of engagement, representation, how we present our material, and then action and expression, which is highlighted in orange on the screen, because that's really where I have started to do a lot of innovations and some research as well. And one way of doing that is offering options for students to demonstrate their learning in various ways, right? So maybe they could choose their assessment type, might have multiple different options for a midterm or for a final, or those sorts of things, right? Let's see. Yes, and research also shows that we have gotten pretty good as faculty on presenting our material in multiple ways, which is really that purple box in the middle. So we're aware that perhaps it might be great to record a lecture, but also include lecture notes that students can read, so they can watch or they can read or they can listen, right? But that faculty have been less comfortable allowing students to have multiple options for them expressing their own knowledge. And that's, that action and expression is where students are required to work relatively independently and maybe might benefit the most from having the ability to select assessment options that are best aligned with their ability to demonstrate the knowledge. So let me just give you some context in terms of where I did a collaborative syllabus design initially and how I researched it and what the classes looked like. So I started this activity for the first time in the fall of 2021, last year, which at the university where I was working, that represented a pretty strong return to face-to-face, more traditional, quote unquote, learning after a year and a half of really disrupted learning from the pandemic. So in that previous year and a half, many of our classes were offered online, either synchronous or asynchronous. And then the university really shifted to back to their residential model. And so it represented, I think, a really great time to innovate in some ways because things were already kind of shaken up quite a bit. And then I will also present some data, and that's from spring of 2022, and I obtained IRB approval to also ask students and study students' responses to this curriculum innovation. Overall, I did it in multiple sections of 5 distinct classes across that year, and then I'm continuing to do it this year as well. So there's quite a few different types of classes in there, though the majority of them were upper level human services classes. So the human services major trained students to work with people with disabilities defined broadly, inclusive of mental health, neurodevelopmental, and physical disabilities. So there's some really good connections in terms of how this strategy in the classroom was also a model for client relations for students. We'll talk about that in a little bit. My classes during 2021, 2022 were smaller. My average enrollment was about 20 students, but I have done the activity in classes with 40 students as well, and found that it worked quite well. Let's see, I'm going to move some boxes around on my screen here. Just for context, the classes that I was teaching at the time were scheduled on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday in 50-minute periods. So as I explained sort of how long this took and what we did in one period to the next, that's sort of the context of the amount of time that it took. It was false advertising a little bit, the title of this session. So it was engaging students on day 1 with a collaborative syllabus design. And I definitely did that, but it also took day 2 and a little bit of day 3. So I'll talk about, my increasing patience, right? Because this takes time. And that's one of the barriers or the challenges, right? Is that we want to get right down into it. And we're really excited about our content. And this takes more time up front with the students to engage with them on this process. So we will take a little break right now and move into Padlet. And this is also a great time if there's questions that would be good for me to answer now. I'd be happy to answer those. But thinking ahead to maybe a course that you will be offering in the spring, what aspects of your course could students reasonably design, do you think? And I will just come out in here and look at the Padlet. And if there's any questions, I'll kind of scroll the chat. That might be good for me to answer now.
Yeah, and I've been trying to keep up on them for you, Megan. I know there's been a lot of dialogue about UDL, and We were just setting the context about how UDL relates to this, and it's a great framework as you think through this type of effort, the collaborative syllabus design. There's certainly people who are really into that topic and are going deeper into the chat, which is great, but we're not going to be able to go into that in today's session. But I love the energy, attention, and focus in that area of universal design and meeting all students' needs as much as possible, whenever possible.
Good, and I'm seeing some great answers here to this. What can our students design, right? So community guidelines is something that we often discuss with our students. Final projects, great. So thinking assessment there, how are they going to demonstrate their knowledge right at the end? Classroom expectations, ways to turn in research assignments, great, right? So some options. Right, additional materials on the topic. So we'll talk about that. Can students be given a little bit of choice in terms of what topics are emphasized? Reading choices, right? How do they participate in the class? Methods of participation, great. So can we offer them multiple ways of participating? So we're not just privileging the students who feel sort of extroverted and able to speak off the cuff in the classroom. Yes, assessments. Good, methods for feedback, excellent. Okay, so let's bump back. And I am going to do a mix now of showing you, teaching you about this, and then also showing you the slides that I showed to the students when I taught them about this. This is a student slide. So after I introduced this idea of creating the syllabus together with them, I got right into the nitty-gritty of what could they do and what couldn't they do. So I explained to them, I can't share power with you about things that I don't have power over, right? So those things that needed to stay the same in the class, in other words, we couldn't collaboratively design them, we couldn't change them, included things like the official course description, right? And the course outcomes. These were previously defined and they couldn't change when students were already enrolled in the class. I have textbook written on the slide in parentheses because the textbook also, we have guidelines around when those have to be submitted in terms of accessibility for students. So the textbook needed to stay the same, but in terms of our order in the textbook, or if we wanted to include other readings or other videos or things from other places that were openly accessible, we could do that. But we had to have that general framework of the textbook. There's certain university policies, and I explained this to the students, that we have in place to protect them, and we're not going to change that. This included, and I saw some conversation about this in the chat too. So this included our Disability Services Office and their process for accommodations. So Universal Design for Learning hopefully opens up your class to the over 60% of students with disabilities in higher education that don't register with disability offices, that they can still have their learning needs accommodated in your class. But certainly if the students are registered with the DSO and have accommodations, they absolutely should present those, and I would of course comply with them. Similar for the academic integrity process that we have at the university, we have a process that is designed to protect both the student and the professors. We needed to follow some policies that were sort of above my pay grade, right? So I wasn't in charge of these things, so I couldn't power share these. The mode, so the class was offered face-to-face. We can't change that once the class starts. I have the word mostly there because I encourage them to think about how we might manage absences or things from their lives that would be pulling them out of class at times when they wanted to participate. So were there ways for them to participate asynchronously or other factors? We talked about that quite a bit. And to use the technology that we had all become familiar with during the previous year. And then I said there were some basic assignment requirements that were put in place by the university. We needed to have a final of some kind, and we needed to have some assignments that came in the first couple of weeks of the class, in order to help them understand how they were doing in the class, right? And to provide some feedback early on. Then I said, but everything else, that's really up to you guys. So we can change any class specific policy. For example, things like attendance and community guidelines, which many of you mentioned on our Padlet. We could change assignments or design new assignments, We could change how we thought of due dates, and students came up with some really interesting ways. If we have time to talk about due dates and how they wanted those managed. The grading methods, right? So how they were graded. And then both the topics, so what we might emphasize within that course description, what we might spend more time on, we could do that somewhat, we could shift those things a bit. And then the teaching methods somewhat, right? So I wanted to know what ways they learned best in the classroom and hopefully be able to adapt to them. But also I'm still a human, and so I'm probably going to have some ways that I teach and some times when I get distracted that I can't change. So I told them to bring a bit of grace to that. So that was helpful for the students. And this is a flow chart for you to sort of look at how did this play out along this first week of classes, right? So before class even started, I told them in an announcement a week before class started through the learning management system that, hey, I was hopeful that they would join me in developing the syllabus for the class together. And I gave them some reflection questions about what has worked for you. Start to think about what has worked for you. What's been a class that's been really ideal in terms of the way it's been designed and the assessments that you've had. And what's a class that has been really difficult, or what have been some barriers to your learning? And how might we design our class to eliminate those barriers? On day one, I provided a mini lecture on collaborative course design and universal design for learning. So I explained, this is why we're doing this, and this is how we're going to do this. And I'll show some of those slides to you in a moment then. I broke the students into small groups of, in between 3 and 5 students. And I gave them a syllabus that was used in the class in previous semesters. And I said, this is here because some of those things that aren't going to change, like the course description and objectives and the university policies are in that syllabus. And then all of the things that can change, right? So assignments and all, here's like what was done before. We don't have to do it the same, but this gives you some ideas. You can read this closely and you can go through this. And then I floated from group to group. And answered questions and scaffolded the conversation, and also kind of encouraged them to think more open, right? So if they were getting stuck, well, this is a previous assignment in the class, I would say, do we have to have that assignment at all, right? What do we need there? What's the purpose of that, right? We know that we need a final for this reason. What do we need building up to the final for you to succeed, helping them to understand some of the rationale for previous assignments that were included in the class, so they could then start to think about how they might design it differently for them. Also on day one throughout and at the beginning, we used anonymous response software. So like Padlet, like we're using today, I used Top Hat in these particular classes. So students could ask questions and suggest things anonymously through their phones or their computers, if they didn't feel comfortable doing so in the group, based on what the power was looking like in the group and what their identities were and the identities of those that they were working with. Then they had some homework on that first day, go home and really read that syllabus and annotate it and mark it up and circle the things you don't like and rewrite things in. And then we came back on the second day, which was a Wednesday, right, on a Monday, Wednesday class. And when I came into the classroom, they were already working on it and having discussions. And then I kind of broke them into the groups again to go over the different components and structures. And then we came together as a whole class, along with, behind me on the big PowerPoint slide, the anonymous response software, so people could respond that way too, if they didn't feel comfortable in the whole class discussion. And we went through things one by one, assignments, policies, attendance, those sorts of things. And I sat down and I took notes and I asked clarifying questions. And then I said, now it's my homework time, and I'm going to redraft the syllabus with particular attention to how you want things designed and how that's different from the original syllabus. And then I say on day 3, I provided them the syllabus draft so that they could check for accuracy and make more changes. That actually occurred the following week because I had several classes I was doing this for. So it took me a little bit longer than to just be able to do that with a 48-hour turnover. So it was the following Monday, so that I could make sure this is what you meant, this is what you wanted, this is how it's written in the syllabus. Does this make sense? And then make any additional, sort of minor revisions that were necessary at that point in time. So here is another example of a student slide and explaining to the students what universal design for learning is and what providing multiple methods for an assignment might look like or might mean. So I told them, UDL is attempting to solve a problem. And I acknowledge that the traditional classroom design assignments and evaluation methods are not equitable. Right? They don't work for all students, and students know this, right, on a deep level. And so I was acknowledging this outright with them so that they could understand why I wanted to do this collaborative syllabus. I explained to them that universal design for learning really emphasizes choice. Right. And so when they got into their small groups and they were talking about, for example, whether to have quizzes or not, or whether to have a test or not, it didn't have to be or not, right? So a student who performs really well on tests and feels like that's good for them and that helps in their learning, they could still have that. They didn't have to argue with the student who said, I do terrible on tests. I get tremendous amounts of test anxiety. I forget everything. Or it takes me a really long time to read and I'm affected by time limits. Instead, they could think about what the objective of the assignment was and how there might be multiple paths to achieve that. So that second point, that students could be autonomous. So we're all getting to the same endpoint in the class, but maybe we're taking different pathways to get there. And that by doing things this way, where we're not pitted against one another, we're developing, a sense of community and a sense of collaboration. And I've heard many times from faculty, and it's even written about in the literature, that if we make class accessible, for one type of student, we're setting up barriers for another type of student, right? But that UDL says not if we offer them options, right? Yes, if we're going to settle on it, it has to be this one way, or you have to show your knowledge in this one particular pathway, then certainly we might accommodate one type of student while setting up barriers for another. But if we include multiple pathways, acknowledging the diversity in our classroom, it doesn't have to be that way. So this is another slide that I showed them really to emphasize that possibility piece, because what I didn't want was my extroverted students who already felt powerful in the classroom to use this as an opportunity to argue for their way of doing things. Those students were important, but so were the other students who maybe traditional classroom design didn't work for. And so they could have possibilities. There could be a possibility in the class for an assessment that only one student took out of 20 or 30, right? And that would be okay. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looked like. So this is some feedback from that day one using anonymous polling software and anonymous response software. The majority of the students said, yep, I want to do this. And here's some examples of what they said, what works for them from the previous year and a half of sort of quote unquote pandemic era learning. The students said being able to decide when they completed asynchronous work was really helpful for them and their success. Being able to work at their own pace, really starting to highlight some ideas of choice there. What doesn't work for them was sort of all things that related to really rigid expectations, right? Or outlines. Some students mentioned things like timed exams or timed quizzes and how stressful that was for them. Strict deadlines and how challenging that was for them in their lives, and how they would often be penalized when they didn't meet a strict deadline. A student several students brought up group projects, right? So that's often something that students don't like. In terms of how we present material, long lectures, slides, and notes. So some of the things that we sort of know are challenging, but I wanted them to be able to start to see these things on the screen as they populate behind me. That's some of the things they were challenged by. Perhaps other students in the classroom were also challenged by. After we did this, halfway through the semester, I gave the students a survey and then the ability to respond to open-ended questions. All of the students, there was 27 students who responded to the survey and the open-ended questions, said that they felt they had a choice and a voice in the creation of the assignments and the policies in the class. That the time spent on this, I think that's probably one of the biggest barriers for a lot of faculty, that the time spent was time well spent for them. And I'll talk about that in a moment too, from my perspective, and that they liked this. They would do this again, given the choice. They would like to collaboratively design their courses. Here's some of those responses to open-ended questions. And for accessibility purposes, I will read some of them out loud. So a student said, it's the first time I ever experienced a course like this, and I hope future students get to do it. A student mentioned, I love how much it's person-centered. Person-centered is a theory for client relations that we use in psychology and human services, where we're really emphasizing individualizing things for an individual we're working with and acknowledging their strengths. And so they could see the parallel in the classroom to that, which was great. Students mentioned that they liked that they could negotiate on the requirements because it puts a level of trust and respect between the students and the professors. So I think that's what many of you were speaking to. And what do you hope to accomplish on day one, right? Community, right? This idea that we're working together here. Another student talked about this, that in the beginning of having meetings, they were able to get to know each other and work together early on, which made it easier for them to collaborate later in things. So it set this expectation that they were going to come to class right away from day one, and their voices were going to be heard, and they were going to be respected, and they were going to be asked their opinions on things. Students said we got to choose and agree on what, as a class, on what we wanted. Another student said, I thoroughly enjoy being taken into consideration when dealing with grading procedures. It gives the students a voice and a feeling of power. So as I said previously, I think this is the last slide that I will do before we'll kind of pause for some questions. And then I'll talk about my critical reflection after that. But in my discipline, and I think in any undergraduate helping disciplines, so things like social work, psychology, human services, pre-med, this is really a model for client relations. So the emphasis is helping our students to understand how they can power share in the future with future clients and consumers of their services. And so if we want them to power share, if we want them to develop egalitarian relationships that acknowledge power and privilege and acknowledge their clients or their consumers' expertise, then I think we got to do that in the classroom, right? And so I was hoping that this was a model for why we do this and how we do this. How do you power share with a future client? That I could kind of show them that in the classroom. Okay, so this is a great time for questions, and you can certainly put them in the chat and I'll scroll through those. And we also have a Padlet where you can either let me know what questions you have or what problems or challenges you see with this activity in your classes. So I will skip over to our Padlet to pay attention there.
And just so folks don't feel like you have to retype your questions into the Padlet. And Megan, I've got several propped up that we'll get to. So feel free to add them to the Padlet if they're new questions. But if you in the last, say, 10, 15 minutes have put some questions in the chat, I've tried to really keep track of those. And I want to certainly acknowledge those and get back to those. First off, and I'll try and help you, Megan, if you scroll up in chat to 924. Heather Brown, you asked, do you give them guidelines or best practices to follow? If you could give us a little bit of the context where you're asking that. I wasn't sure if that was to a colleague in the chat or if that was to Megan at that moment. So if we could just get a little bit more, if you want to put a new prompt there in the chat, then that would be great. I know Andrew had a question, wanting to hear more about how you come up with the students on grading methods or due dates. He's just wondering how you can arrive at some consensus. So how do you kind of shake that out?
Yeah, so I tried to avoid things that were either or, that we had to vote And so I see that also in our Padlet. How do you work with, outlier students who feel that their voices are not reflected in the final design? The way that Universal Design for Learning provides a roadmap for this, for example, I had a class that really wanted to do a final presentation instead of a paper. So they had the original class design had this, somewhat lengthy paper, and the students said, we want to do a presentation. And I had a student who, in the anonymous response software, which I think is really important that you use that, said, I have terrible anxiety and I'll drop the class if I have to do a presentation, right? And so we included an option, right, for presentation, but also an option for paper, and then an option for a pre-recorded presentation that I would watch. And I had one student who did the paper, and it was an outstanding paper. And it met all the same requirements that the students who did the presentations did. And so perhaps that may be different in other disciplines where, you feel public speaking is required. In my discipline, it wasn't, right? So they could choose in that final assignment. And so I tried to really make sure that we were allowing it to open up, that they can have different options. Another example of that is some students feel they need firm deadlines for their work. Everything needs to be at a set time or I'll never do it. And other students said, I will always procrastinate and then not have it done. And so we talked about this back and forth, and I had to be really patient about how they wanted to manage this. And the idea we came up with in one class, and this I think is different for me, who when I went to college, I didn't use a learning management system. They wanted the assignment in this one class, assignments were due at the set, dates that we set, but they were open for an additional 3 days with no penalty. And this, I think, for them, in the way that it shows up in the learning management system for a due date, and then, sort of a close date, they're reminded, and then when they do it, was influential. For me, I just considered that close date my due date. That's when I graded things, was after that. But for the students, this made a really big deal. They had a deadline, and then they had this like extra window of flexibility. So they were really good about negotiating and trying to make sure that they were including everyone in the classroom. I didn't really have any challenges there. How detailed do I let them get? Maybe some of those examples answer that. Super detailed, right? All the way down to deadlines. That's a great, so the time commitment question, I'd like to answer that. That's a really great question, and is on my next slide. So I also teach a 4-4 and am super busy. So how is the workload for the instructor in terms of prep and grading compared to designing a course in a typical way? I think that the workload is similar. The challenge for me is that I like to have everything done so far in advance, right? Like my course is built in the LMS, the syllabus is done, everything's really tight and perfect. And that I couldn't do. So I had a lot more work in those first 2 weeks of class. I still did build my course in the LMS for those of you who teach asynchronously or things like that. I built it the way that I had it built previously, based on the old syllabus, quote unquote. And then in that week, when I was giving them the new syllabus, we agreed on that new syllabus, and they told me if I had missed anything. Then I went in and changed everything. So it was already in the learning management system, but things would need to be changed or added or removed. So I wasn't sort of starting from scratch in there, but that first 2 weeks, there's a lot more work. I will say at the end, in terms of grading or when you have assignments, I think UDL makes grading easier. So if I have to read 40 papers, that is just exhausting for me. But if I have to read 15 papers, watch 15 presentations, and grade 15 exams, right? It's almost easier as an instructor. I don't feel like it creates more work. And I think if you're considering this, getting a little bit of training from CAST and UDL really helps you to start to problem solve through those things. I also think you can start small, right? Like this is a deep end strategy. And you can start small by identifying, this is the one thing that this semester I will let the students decide and see how it goes. For a lot of us, that ends up being like classroom expectations. I would encourage you to go a little bit deeper than that, right? So could you do like one assessment and see how that goes? One traditional paper or exam or final or something like that, and allow the students to really work that out. And then you can start to build more from there if it works well for you.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And whenever doing something different, it's always good to experiment incrementally. Don't expect to overhaul and have everything go perfectly. And then that's just a huge burden and a huge risk. So that's great advice. I know, Megan, you mentioned asynchronous, and I think Edward had to leave, but brought it up earlier, and there was another mention about online. So with asynchronous, there isn't a first day experience that they all have at the same time, but there can be certainly a first week window where some of these things can be replicated through discussion boards or through Padlets, or you want to break students out maybe into groups and have them annotating the syllabus using Perusall or whatever tools. And so you can still, as an instructor, get all that input and feedback and then do that adaptation and respond to students and do it in an asynchronous way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I teach or did teach previously, I'm not this year, asynchronously as well. And so that's what I would suggest too, Brett, right? So the discussion board route, and you want to make sure, as you do with all things in an asynchronous course, that things are really well defined. So this is a discussion board about the final, right? Or this is a discussion board about late work policies, so that they know exactly what they're responding to. And again, an asynchronous course might be one where it's a little bit easier for you to sort of add on one thing at a time and see how that power sharing works over time.
Great. And then Roberto brought up a question. This could apply to instructors of online courses, but you haven't really created the course yourself. Maybe that course has been given to you as an adjunct or otherwise. And so you might have limited control over what changes you can make. And then it would just be a matter of working within the parameters of your department's policies, let's say, for that course, and asking questions about what changes are appropriate to be able to make as the instructor, if you're not the lead instructor of that course.
Yep. And so I had some similar to that, in terms of that slide, what can change and what can't change, right? And so being really honest and transparent with students, right? That you cannot change things that you're not allowed to change, right? And I use that language with them, right? This is above my pay grade. We might all want to do yoga and talk about Netflix when we come together every week, but we can't change that much we can't do. But in a class on different psychological disorders, can we determine how much time we spend on eating disorders versus schizophrenia spectrum disorders? Yep, we can do that. Right.
Great. And let's try another one here is, how do you make sure students' suggested choices meet the same requirements of the assessment you originally designed? So is that clear?
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So I think it's also fair to say that all the classes that I did this in, I had taught at least 3 or 4 times before. So I was really familiar with what the traditional outcomes were. If it was a course I was teaching for the first time, I think this would be a little bit more challenging. But I worked this out with the students in terms of how long it takes to do something. So let me give an example. I had a traditional final in one class. So it was an exam. It included multiple choice questions and short answer questions and an essay. They could take that. Or one of the options that we came up with was that they could do a 15-minute pre-recorded presentation that I would watch that gave a big picture overview of the entire class, what the class covered, then delved into 5 key topics that they learned in the class. They had to cover each for 2 to 3 minutes. And we created a rubric with level of detail that had to be covered there. And then their one key takeaway from the class. They had to prepare this presentation and had to be professionally recorded along with some sort of visual aid that they were using. And can you argue that that's different than a test? Definitely. Do I think that the students who did the presentation, that was any less rigorous than the test? No. Did they choose more what they focused on than maybe I would with the test? Yes. But I think their level of learning, their knowledge, their ability to explain what was learned to them was super, it was a super deep level of learning. What I find, and there's a question here, like, what about the students if they feel like that's not equal? There was enough collaboration with the students and options that for a lot of students, what I just described in terms of that pre-recorded presentation, they're like, oh, no way, that's way too much work for me. I would rather take the exam, right? Or I'm uncomfortable with pre-recording or with doing a presentation. And so I think because it was set up with this, hey, the way that you learn and the way that you demonstrate your learning isn't going to be the same. It's impossible that we would all do things the same, right? And so we want to make this equal. I think you would have more arguments about equity come up when the students don't feel like there is an option for them where they can succeed. And at least that's the way. And that might be discipline specific too. So my students were already socialized into the idea of things being socially just.
Great. And Megan, can you see Heather's question came up a moment ago about rubrics and how did you prep the students for rubric building?
Yeah, so Universal Design for Learning emphasizes single point rubrics, which are a little bit easier to make and maybe easier for students to understand. So for a lot of these classes, like I said, I had taught them maybe 3+ times. I had rubrics, single point rubrics created, and so then it was just adjusting them. If the paper had to talk about 5 key points, now the presentation had to talk about 5 key points, right? So it was along those lines. So it wasn't the students, I showed them all the rubrics that we already had for the assignments they had. So they kind of helped me prep that out and critique it, and then I worked on them. But yes, those first 2 weeks of class, you have a little bit more work. And Tracy, yes, I think you're exactly right that the emphasis is on meeting what is the objective of this assignment, not on the particular way of expressing it, right?
Yeah, and Christine's question about where you might be in a program where there are specific credential or accreditation requirements of students that they have to do a specific task a certain way. There is that one way of knowing or demonstrating. That's where, yeah, UDL doesn't come into play as much, and you have to sometimes let go of UDL a little bit, and that's the outcome the students have to achieve in that way.
Yeah, and I think some of the way, so Christine, I'm in psychology. We have one of the most rigorous for practice for clinical counseling psychology, like the testing requirements, and then in graduate programs, how do you prepare students for those national licensing exams and things like that? That may be speaking to what you're talking about there. And I spoke to some nursing faculty as well who have similar requirements. And some of what one thing that I did there was in terms of quizzes in a class where we actually had to have quizzes and a multiple choice test, was how many times they could attempt a quiz, right? And with really big question banks, multiple attempts on a quiz are not easier. Right? It just means that the students are spending more time engaging with the quiz. And so for a class where I had to have that particular type, we came up with some modifications in terms of how they could take the quiz, and all the multiple attempts that they could have. And now I had students who were spending an hour and a half taking quizzes with a much higher score than the 20 minutes that they spent. And students really spoke positively about that, where they weren't so stressed when they went to open a quiz because they knew they could do it again, and it was a learning process. All right, I'm going to switch back now just to go over some of the points that I want to make sure we touch on in terms of my critical reflection. In terms of the benefits, I've done a lot of different ways where I tried to get students to really read the syllabus super closely, and I never felt like they did. And in this collaborative syllabus design, they knew this syllabus backwards and forwards. So there was so much less questions being asked later in the semester where, typically I would be socializing them to, this is an assignment coming up and this is what you have to do. I relied on them a little bit more. So, you can make your judgments of me based on that, but I would say, okay, wait, now remind me, because we had just redesigned things, right? In every class, you're redesigning with that class for those students. Remind me, what are we doing? Let's look at the syllabus again. What is this final assignment options? Okay, yes, we talked about this. And they would know, because they are the ones who had designed it. And so that was a little bit of a time saving piece in terms of how well they knew the class. Their buy-in into the assignments was totally different because it was assignments that they had created. So in a class where they worked in partners throughout the whole semester to demonstrate skills of case management, which is, I think, a little bit about the question we were talking about a moment ago. There was always issues with partners and groups, and we talked about that a lot at the start of the semester when we were designing the syllabus. They decided the way that we want you to do our case management partners is we want you to randomly assign them, and this is how we're going to handle conflicts. And they created the whole method. And those 2 semesters, I never had any problems with their partnerships or their groups. And I think that was in part because they had designed it in a way that they felt was going to be fair and equitable for them. But also they had thought about all the other possibilities before they settled on a design. And so their buy-in was just really different. They had, they reported a sense of autonomy, and I really saw the way that they would start their assignments and approach their assignments and assessments and approach class discussions, that they felt a lot more ownership of the learning in the classroom, I think. We definitely had a class community. So these were semesters after the pandemic when students were maybe a little bit pulled back, or not after the pandemic, but in 2021, 2022. And the students, we set this expectation in this first week of class, and I would come into class and they would always already be talking to one another and already be really engaged. And so I felt like we really had this sense of community. And I do think anonymous response software is key there. Some of the challenges you've already touched on are time, right? So this takes a significant amount of time out of your class in the beginning of the semester, and then out of your first 2 weeks in the beginning of the semester as you're sort of modifying and adjusting things based on what the students want. So that is a challenge. I think it's time well spent, and I'm still doing it. But you might do, 1 or 2 classes at a time. It requires you to be quite nimble, right? So you're going into the semester thinking, I think the class is going to be like this, but I don't know until after that first week of classes. And so you have to be nimble in terms of the redesign of your learning management system, and of how you're running the class. For students that may operate the way I originally did, they really like things to be well planned out from the start. And you get into the class and you say, we're going to design this class together. And they're like, what? Right. So it might be sort of uncomfortable at first, that ambiguity. And so I think, as Brett said in the beginning, it's sort of this combination of doing this open pedagogy and allowing them a lot of choice, but kind of keeping some bumpers on, right? So I think giving them a previous iteration of the syllabus is really helpful there, so they can kind of see, okay, so assessments, okay, attendance, right? And they can kind of come up with what it is that they have to look at. That can be helpful. This question came up, and there's been a lot of scholarly conversation about the idea of rigor and how rigor may in fact be another way of saying not all students belong here, right? Not all students should be able to achieve. I think a preoccupation with rigor, with sameness, with fairness is what prevents us from making our classes really inclusive. And I will say that I do not think that my students made the class any less quote unquote rigorous through this collaborative course design. For example, I had one class that had a final portfolio and no midterm, and they created a midterm portfolio because they wanted an earlier point of assessment on that portfolio. So I don't see that it made the class less rigorous, nor do I think that's a particularly helpful concept when we're thinking about inclusive education, and we think about what do we really mean by rigor. So thank you very much. And I think maybe we have like 2 minutes, right, Brett, for a few more questions if there are any.
Exactly. We're pretty well caught up in the chat, but folks, feel free to add anything else in the brief time that we have left. I'm going to do one last housekeeping item and then check back on the chat here and give Megan a moment of pause. Megan, if you could go to the next slide, and I think you just have some resources if folks are interested about some of the research that's behind what she's shared today. It's always good to know that there's research that backs this, and you've heard some of these mentioned, and some of these would be additional, and then you have the source references as well. Let's go on to the last one. So as a reminder, we will share the recording and slides from today. You can, as I think it was Sandra that noted, you can go to live transcript at the bottom of the screen right now, and then you can save the transcript. I also shared the chat save a little bit ago, and I can do that here again as well. And we can try and add that on to the distribution. Those tend to be kind of messy time-coded files, those TXT files. I think your live transcript capture right now would be a great option, but we'll do what we can to support you for sure. Next webinar, so December 8th on Thursday, we're going to do Burnt Out and Overburdened, the Faculty Experience 2022. And the reason why we have the 2022 on there is, there's been this progressive burnout and anxiety and overload and all of these things, but we actually have a study that we did in the last couple of months and some exciting results to share, and a white paper to make available to folks, and a dialogue to have on December 8th about where we are in that condition of burnout, and then what might we be able to do going forward to better support the faculty experience. I'll put the registration link in the chat for you in just a moment here, but we will send that to you with today's materials as well. We'll send you the invite to the next one. So let's check in and do a look to see if there are any questions. I'm seeing comments, thank yous, and feedback. We appreciate that. And thank you again for your time today and your contributions from so many of you. And thank you, Megan, for leading a great session.
Yeah, and thank you to all our attendees for your interaction and responses. It's really interesting to hear the different things that come up when we talk about this.